Today, we will be discussing Hohfeld's analytical framework for examining rights. We will soon see that the way that Hohfeld defines rights is very different from the way that we mean it when we use it in conventional parlance today. So Wesley Newcomb Hohfeld was a professor at the School of Law at Yale University and authored the seminal work on rights in 1913, Fundamental Legal Conceptions as Applied in Judicial Reasoning, before passing away prematurely at the tender age of 39. So the question I pitched to you this week is, why are Hohfeld's fundamental legal conceptions so fundamental? And we often hear rights claims in modern society, and they exude a contradictory quality about them. So when people claim that they have a right to life, then there's also a right to die. They claim a right to vote, but also a right not to vote, a right to work, but a right to choose, a right to gender identity, women's rights, a right to be heard, a right to silence, a right to privacy, etc., etc. Like Hohfeld, we too experience on a daily basis assertions of rights as often as he encountered noises. And by that, I mean with the same numbing frequency and in all manner of contexts. So even at the time that Hohfeld was writing in 1913, he observed that rights talk was loose talk. And this made the author question the way that the public and even members of the legal profession, who he thought should know better, spoke about rights. He began to scorn the fact that too often the term rights was conflated with other Jural entitlements. And this conflation, he noticed, started with judges, politicians, and lawyers. This made him perplexed about the incalculable implications that this ambiguity may have for democratic societies. That, in addition to the fact that rights talk often occurred at the expense of a discussion of duties, which he also saw as part of the category of what he dubbed jural correlatives. So he saw rights and duties are like two sides of the same coin, and yet he noticed that people preferred to talk about rights and not mention duties. So what do people mean when they use the term right? So when people use the term right, I think what they mean is an entitlement, whether it be moral or legal. And we often hear, I have a right to something, or I have a right to perform something. You also hear, it's my right to be something, or it is my right to do something. Conversely, you also hear, I have a right not to do something, or I have a right not to be someone. And these various expressions take place in a variety of different circumstances with respect to a seemingly and growingly infinite number of objects. So at a glance, the term rights seems to encompass the following definitions: any entitlements to or not to perform certain actions, or to be or not to be in certain states, or any entitlements that others perform or not perform certain actions against us, or to be or not to be in certain states. So there is a common category of rights. They're positive rights and negative rights. And positive rights are an entitlement to do things, a right to freedom of opinion and expression. And negative rights, on the other hand, are entitlements to not do things, like the right not to vote, which is a right in America, but we have a compulsory voting system in Australia, so that is not something that we have a right with regards to. Now, in this video, we'll be discussing what Hohfeld believes we actually mean when we use the term rights. In other words, what are the categories and subcategories and their implications? And this brings us to the second expression we must clarify, and that is the expression jural relations. So in order to understand the precise meaning of right, Hohfeld thought we must first understand its basic makeup to see how it works in practice. So in order to understand the basic nature of a right, we must first accept that rights cannot exist in a vacuum. This is because by its very nature, a right requires that another person or persons to perform acts or refrain from performing certain acts with respect to that object of the right. This ontology of right presupposes that moral and legal agents exist in relationship to others. And too often, modern rights talk lends itself to the appearance that rights are these autonomous things, like it's like a beacon of light suspended in a vat of darkness. But the fact of the matter is, a right cannot exist in isolation from other types of claims. And this is what Hohfeld observed. So, jural relations, and this first term is derived from the Latin term jure or jus, meaning law, and is used to describe legal relationships or legal connections between at least two persons. And the following example may assist in highlighting this intrinsic aspect of rights that Hohfeld observed. So when I was first introduced to Hohfeld's jural relations framework, I was in law school. I was about fourth year, and I was doing jurisprudence. And I remember distinctly that it refreshed a very traumatic memory actually about doing chemistry in high school. And I was not one that was very good at the sciences. I preferred the humanities. And so for me, that is a memory that sticks with me. But in that chemistry class, I remember learning about substances which are formed when a number of atoms are fused together. And a very basic example would be H2O, which is water, and it's formed when two hydrogen and oxygen atoms fuse together through a process called chemical bonding. Now, this atomic structure can be seen as fundamental to the essence of the thing itself, water. So before we wander too far into that geek territory in memory lane, Hohfeld's framework therefore presupposes this fundamental relational structure when he undertakes the exercise of breaking down what was generally being referred to as rights. So like my analogy, it's kind of like he thought that it was important that we broke the idea of rights down to its component or molecular parts in order to understand what we're dealing with when we are looking at the whole. So he makes the important point of underscoring the discussion of rights with this idea that individuals exist as part of a larger collective whole, and that in such a community context, our individual claims are never ones that are made in isolation, but require actions on the part of another person or persons to respect that entitlement. So a right claim is made in a web of social relationships with associated ramifications. And that's something that's important to bear in mind as we trudge through this, I guess. So Hohfeldian jural entitlements. What does Hohfeld mean when he uses the term rights? So Hohfeld begins his analysis of rights by distinguishing them from other type of entitlements, which we too often, he thought, confused and put in the box of this term rights. So keep in mind this whole time that Hohfeld's objective was to expose the ambiguities associated with this term and not simply to make our heads explode or his students' heads explode. Jural entitlements are broadly a claim to self-determination, and Hohfeld breaks jural entitlements into 4 subcategories. And these are namely right, privilege, power, and immunity. And we'll discuss this in more depth with examples shortly. But then Hohfeld goes on to define them in relation to what he calls their jural correlatives, which are duty, no right, liability, and disability. He then draws out each claim's relationship with their jural opposites, which turns the seemingly 2D model into a 3D model. And I'll show you, and that's illustrated by the diagram on the screen when you have this idea of jural relations and their correlatives with their opposites. It becomes sort of best illustrated by 3D diagram. So if you look at the screen, there it is for you. So the basic elements of Hohfeld's fundamental legal conceptions, what are they? There are 2 key features of Hohfeld's scheme, and I tried to summarize those so far. But the first is that Hohfeld sets out to analyze legal concepts in terms of their jural bilateral relationship between two or more legal actors. And you'll notice that there's always two separate parties in a Hohfeldian relation, and he notes that as A and B. The second is that each Hohfeldian relation is always concerned with a given action by one of the parties. So it's with respect to something, an action X. So let's look more closely at Hohfeld's 4 types of rights. Hohfeld posits that when a judge or lawyers talk about rights, they mean one of 4 things. The first is a right, which he also says is synonymous with claim. The second is a privilege, which is interchangeably used with liberty. The third is power. And the fourth is immunity. So firstly, right in the strict sense meaning claim. Hohfeld defines right as a claim by reference to its correlative, and the concept, which is the concept of a duty. So if B has a duty in respect of A regarding action X, then naturally A would have a right in respect of B. So he said that you can identify whether something is a right if you can firstly identify whether there is a duty, then you know that the correlative thing would be a right. And conversely, vice versa, when A has a right against B in respect of action X, this means that B has a duty to do or refrain from doing something X in respect of A. So for example, if there is a duty not to steal under the criminal code in that particular state, then there must be a corresponding right to property. For example, as the legal owner of a pen, A, I have a proprietary right in respect of pen, not to have others, B, take it or use it without my permission, and that would be the action X. On the flip side, the world at large, B, are under a duty not to take my pen without my permission. So let's have a look at the second category of jural entitlements, as Hohfeld sets out or outlines, as privilege or liberty. So he further complicates the issue by defining privilege as being the opposite of a duty. So it's not a correlative, but an opposite. He, however, defines privilege by reference to its logical correlative, and the concept is a no right, which is interestingly the opposite of a right. So if A has a privilege in respect of B regarding action X, then A lacks a duty in respect of B regarding that same action. So in other words, A can do what he or she pleases as far as X is concerned, and B has a no right to interfere or control A with respect to that action, X. And I'll lay out an example for you to make it a bit clearer to understand. An Australian citizen A has a privilege pursuant to the Constitution of Australia in respect of X, political communication, whereby B, other persons, including the government, have a no right to interfere with X, however A wishes to communicate on a political matter. If you recall back to 2020, the Australian government set a mandate on mask wearing in public places. Now, in response, if you recall, some people protested against it by insisting that they had a right not to wear a mask. Now, in Hohfeldian terms, this was not technically a right, but a privilege, as the correlative is not a duty, but rather a no right on the part of other persons, including the government, to interfere with the privilege of not wearing a mask. And so not wearing a mask is the action X, and it has at least two parties. A, the person who insists that they have a right not to wear a mask or a privilege not to wear a mask, and the correlative, jural correlative being a no right on the part of B, other persons, including the government. All right, so at this juncture, I will borrow an illustration by Madeline Morris, professor of law at Duke University, who uses the example of a car park to draw out the distinction between these two entitlements and a right, between a right and a privilege, because sometimes it's quite confusing to navigate the exact differences between these two. I think these are the most confusing two, but also quite important because the distinction means that the correlative, the Jural correlative, would be very different. Duty and a no right are very different things, and imposes a different incumbent action on the other party. So Morris writes, quote unquote, and I'll read directly from the text here. Suppose that I like to park in a parking space X because it is closest to my office. If I have a reserved space parked to parking space X, then I have a Hohfeldian right to that space, and you have a corresponding duty not to park in that space. If, on the other hand, I have a general monthly parking pass, then I have a Hohfeldian privilege to park in space X. I may park in space X if it is empty, but I'm not guaranteed access to it. When I arrive, you may have already parked in space X, since you have no duty to refrain from and indeed have the privilege of parking there. So a no right obviously means that there is no duty to refrain from doing something, and that the person with the privilege must either wait for the person to move their car if they want parking spot X, or queue. So thus, when I have a Hohfeldian right, she continues, I have a right to enjoy the object of that entitlement, parking space X. By contrast, when I have a Hohfeldian privilege, I have the privilege of enjoying or attempting to enjoy the object of that entitlement, parking space X, but without your having any corresponding duty. You have no duty to refrain from parking in that space. So it puts a weaker obligation on the other person when it is a privilege as opposed to a right. Hohfeld goes on to define power. So he defines power as an ability to bring about change in legal relations. And so A has a power in respect of B regarding the action X, where A is able to change B's legal relations by performing that action. And an example can be made for like contract from contract law. Offerer is A and has the power to change the legal position of the offeree, B, concerning X, whether to make an offer for contract. Hohfeld goes to talk about the fourth Jural entitlement, and that's immunity. So the holder of an immunity A is not exposed to the exercise of a power within the domain covered by the immunity X. In that domain, everyone vis-a-vis whom the immunity pertains, B, is under a disability from changing the immunity holder's entitlement. That's an example can be brought up. Once you, A, became 18, you have a legal immunity to vote, drink, marry, etc. And that's X, whatever action you want to be the object of the immunity, in respect of which your parents are under a disability, at least legally speaking, from changing those entitlements. So I'll end by us having a look at this question. What is the value of Hohfeld's dual relations framework for us today in our modern world? Consider there has to be many historical changes that may have rendered Hohfeld's framework redundant to a large degree. I personally disagree with that comment, but critics might say that Universal Declaration of Human Rights was only founded in the 50s. Hohfeld was writing in the early 20th century, and so perhaps this framework is limited in time and space to his particular era. So let's consider the value of the framework for us in modern society. Hohfeld, by outlining a set of fundamental legal conceptions that could be used to analyze legal relationships, sought to clarify and simplify the ideas of those relationships. So in so doing, what was Hohfeld creating? He was creating a more precise analysis that distinguished between convoluted concepts and then which thus offered a method for critiquing the broader legal principles out there. In other words, he creates a framework by which we are encouraged to critically assess the terms, analyze the terms rights, and not simply take them on face value because the term itself holds some kind of mystical authority. Hence, I think that the usefulness of this framework can be found in us being able to be encouraged to work out the legal and moral implications for ourselves and to see what impact those claims might have on others. As well as we find that a lot of individuals and groups in modern society speak exclusively in terms of rights without being forthcoming about the ramifications for the wider community or persons outside that qualifying or group or identifying with that group. So when we apply this to the field of law, Hohfeld's scheme of jural relations might show us that this kind of analytical jurisprudence may be a tool for any legal professional to properly discharge their duties. So practically applied, this analysis may expose policy considerations or policy implications, identify issues arising in practical decision-making by illuminating erroneous assumptions and incorrect formulations, allow concrete solutions to legal problems by identifying other parties involved in the equation or involved in the, rights claim, and then enable us on this kind of bedrock of when after we've identified all of those things and correctly categorize the particular claim being made, we can come up with viable reforms. So though Hohfeld originally intended his theory of analysis for legal relations, his work has largely been used in moral and political philosophy. So it was extrapolated and found useful in all those different contexts. Now let's turn to the weaknesses. If you've had a chance to look at the Slag article on Hohfeld's work, she aptly sums up the issue in her introduction. So the author opens with the statement that Newcomb Hohfeld's 1913 work is undoubtedly brilliant, and I don't think anyone can really contend that. However, her caveat for the reader, for the new reader, when they approach Hohfeld, is to approach with caution, because firstly, it might come off as seemingly counterintuitive, especially for someone like myself who is more well-versed in the humanities. And she expresses it in these terms: it's as thrilling as chewing on sawdust. She does go on to write that this lack of aesthetic charm should not detract from the overarching value we can discover in his works. So I think that Hohfeld's framework is personally quite valuable, but we'll talk about that in the conclusion. But let's see what the critics have to say against the framework. So critics have said that there are few issues with Hohfeld's analysis. The first is that he offers no substantive concept of law, nor does he define what gives these conceptions their legal character. So I suppose they're talking about the jural entitlements as well as their correlatives. The second criticism leveled at Hohfeld relate to his jural relations framework. The contention is that not every right has a correlative duty. So most broadly, what is being attacked here is the inadequate explanations for both the content of the entitlements, but also the flimsiness, I guess, of his treatment of the relational aspects of this framework. In my personal opinion, and without dismissing the technical weaknesses the critics have leveled at Hohfeld's framework, I do still believe that Hohfeld's framework deserves some recognition as a valuable prism for critiquing this modern rights talk. So in our current context today, where increasingly rights are becoming concepts that bear some sort of unquestioned authority, this framework encourages us to think critically about the concept itself. Now, if you believe in human nature being inherently fallible, as I do, any concept that bears such unquestioned authority comes with an inherent risk, and that's the risk of bypassing healthy philosophical discussions about the merits of any claim. This kind of philosophical method, like the one that Hohfeld proposes, reminds us of the importance of not simply taking things on face value because someone in authority or power told us to. So it helps us to value the process of questioning what individuals, groups, and governments might say. And thus we go full circle to the idea of the philosophical method. I think that this particular framework is useful because it encourages us to think like philosophers should, to engage in healthy discourse and discussion in order to get closer to the truth. So on that note, I'll leave you for the week, but feel free to leave your comments. I would love to hear what you have to say. Until my next video, thank you for joining me, and I'll see you soon.